Okay, am I fully in the picture?
Just hold on one second. We're live.
Okay.
But you need to probably lower your camera a slight tad there. There you go. Up too much. Right there's perfect. Perfect.
Okay.
All right, gang. Here we go. Here we go. On with the show. Good night, everybody. It's Steve Grumbine. We're Real Progressives. Glad you could join us. Tonight, it's a special edition of the Joe Firestone Show. We were preempted by Senior Bernie Sanders Saturday night. So, in any event, tonight is going to be a special show. Joe is going to talk about the $100 trillion coin. But before we get into the $100 trillion coin, I just want to, before we get there, give me 1 second, folks. I want to make mention that, Real Progressives is, there for you, and we look forward to serving your needs. We serve progressives wherever they are. We are nonpartisan. Our goal is merely to educate and to unite and to bring about progress and change, utilizing tools that we feel are instrumental to making those changes happen. And without further ado, I'm going to bring on my partner in crime, Mr. Joe Firestone. Welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, Steve. What's going on tonight?
Well, I'll be perfectly honest with you. My mind is completely wrapped up in the Grateful Dead at the moment. I am doing everything I possibly can to find a way to catch them either in Camden, New Jersey, or go down there to the Jiffy Lube Center in Virginia and catch them. I am just like frazzled. I want to go so bad, and they have. So anyway, you were talking. You were one of the people that led the charge with the minting the coin back a few years ago when the debt ceiling crisis kicked in. And
yes, I'm probably the one who wrote the most about it during that period of time, and then I also wrote a book about it too. The only book about it so far.
Well, this is exciting then. So the guests are in for a treat. Without further ado, Joe Firestone, take it away, sir.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay, first of all, my title for this was actually People Who Say Treasury's Capability to Spend is Constrained by Its Tax and Loan Revenue are just plain wrong. Okay. So, Steve, could you put up the first of the graphics, the federal government spending process?
I sure can, Joe. Hold on 1 second. Spending process is up, and I am dropping.
Oh, there we go. Steve, can you hear me? No,
I can, Joe, but I have to drop off here, so it takes me out of the picture. Don't worry, you're going to be fine.
Okay.
I hear everything. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, so the reason why I did this diagram of the federal spending process is through various things I've seen on our Facebook page and our videos. It didn't seem to me that people were quite getting the detail of the federal spending process. And while a lot of people were getting the maximum that the maxim that taxes don't fund spending, taxes don't fund spending either, but taxes don't fund spending, and also that it's Congress that funds the spending, it didn't seem to me that people were aware of the chain of reasoning that allows us to say that taxes don't fund spending. Okay, and also another problem is that even when we ourselves understand the reasoning behind the idea that taxes do not fund federal spending, we still might have a problem explaining that to other people I shouldn't say that we necessarily have a problem explaining it to other people, but even when we do explain it to other people, and even when we give them a good explanation, we don't always persuade them because it's hard for them to get the rather abstract reason why taxes cannot possibly fund federal spending. So, by this account of the federal government spending process, I hope to shed some light on that also. So, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see that spending begins with congressional appropriations. Now, one could go deeper into that particular process, talk about how bills originate in Congress and the authorization bills for federal spending. Okay, and then finally the appropriations bills, which are the bills that actually fund federal spending. Okay, now why do we say they fund federal spending? Well, that's kind of commonsensical. Okay, in the following way, let's say that you were getting a loan from a bank, and they gave you an approval of the loan. It's the approval of the loan that actually funds the spending. Now, after that, of course, the bank goes through mechanics, and it deposits the loan funds it creates in your account. But we still say that it was the approval by the bank that actually funded the loan. We don't say that it was the mechanics of depositing the money in your account that actually funds the loan. Because once they've made a decision, they owe you those funds in your account. Okay, so it's kind of analogous here. Congress makes a decision which allows the federal government to spend. And Congress's funding decision then mandates the executive branch to get the money in its spending account so it can, in fact, spend what Congress has ordered it to spend. Okay? So, here's the way things go. Okay? A very common path, perhaps the main path initially, is that the balance in the Treasury spending account is high enough that Treasury can simply spend the money which has been appropriated to do a particular thing. And so that's a simple process. The executive branch gets a congressional appropriation, and it has the money in its spending account in the Federal Reserve, and it spends that money. So that's a common path. Let's call that path one. Okay? However, sometimes the balance in the spending account, and I should add here that the Treasury likes to keep a balance of at least $5 billion in its account each day, and sometimes a lot more because it's expecting a lot of spending on that particular day. It's basically projecting a lot of spending on that day. So the balance might be much higher than $5 billion, but it likes to have at least $5 billion in that account. When it doesn't have the $5 billion, then often the spending account balance is not high enough for Treasury to spend appropriations or to repay debt. In other words, debt instruments are always falling due, and those are for spending that was previously appropriated a long time ago, and which the Treasury spent by first going through one of the sub-processes that we're going to talk about here, in just a second. One of the processes involving acting by Treasury to get the Fed to create reserves in its account. Okay. I want to also say a word about what kinds of reserves are created in the Treasury's spending account. In the monetary system, there are at least two kinds of reserves that are placed in banks. One kind are reserves created by the banks themselves, if you will, bank money. The heavy majority of the reserves in banks are actually bank money. Okay? But then there are the reserves created by the Federal Reserve. And those reserves are high-powered money. That's the money the federal government must spend in. That's the money in which legal settlements must be made. That's the kind of money that must be used to settle tax payments in the end. And that's the money, that relatively small proportion, of money that the Federal Reserve banks are creating using the authority of Congress that backs the whole monetary system. So, there are two paths I've shown here. The first path deals with the most common situation, which is where the Fed, to fill its account, where the Treasury, to fill its account, its spending account, orders the Fed to debit its Treasury tax and loan accounts and to credit its spending account. It's what we normally think of as a transfer, but as we'll see in a minute, it isn't really quite a transfer. Okay, but what it is a debit to the Treasury tax and loan accounts, which exist in the private sector, and a credit to the Treasury spending account, which is a public sector bank account, that the Treasury has at the Federal Reserve, and that only has high-powered money in it. So then the Fed obeys the order of the Treasury, and it marks down the Treasury tax and loan accounts, the TTL accounts, they're called in short. So it debits those accounts, and it credits, that is, it marks up the Treasury general account in the same amount that it has debited the TTL accounts. Now, this might look to you and might look to the person who doesn't think through what is going on here, that the Treasury is using the money in the Treasury tax and loan accounts to fill up the TGA and then later to spend that particular money. But that is not what really happens in the detail of it, as we'll see in just a minute. But anyway, when the Treasury marks up its spending account, in this way, then if the account balance is high enough, it spends and implements the congressional mandate that came from the appropriations of Congress. So that's one sub-processes under the heading, if the spending account balance isn't high enough, then Treasury acts to get the Fed to create reserves in its account. So the other pathway is that the federal government has the legal authority, hardly used, to fill the Treasury spending account, to mint coins and then deposit the coins in its Treasury accounts. Okay, in a minute, we'll get into the Treasury account that's involved. And we'll get to the process also by which the Fed marks up the Treasury spending account for what's called the coin seigniorage, which it gets from the minting of the coins and later depositing them. Okay, so again, once the markup of the Treasury general account is done, if the Treasury spending account balance is high enough at that point, then the Treasury just spends, completing the third path, okay, which I have diagrammed here. Okay, so let's talk about coin seigniorage for just a second before I go into the detail of these two paths. Coin seigniorage, as I've said before, is the difference between the cost of the coins created by the government and the face value when those coins are accepted by someone, including the Federal Reserve. When the Fed accepts the deposit of a coin, it always credits Treasury with its face value. Now, it costs about $3,500 to mint and transport a 1-ounce platinum coin with a face value of $100 trillion. In the case of that example, the difference between the $3,500 and the $100 trillion is nearly $100 trillion, obviously. So if the Treasury were ever to do something like this, the process would end up with nearly $100 trillion in the Treasury account. Okay. Now note that just because it has the $100 trillion in the Treasury account doesn't give the authority to the Treasury Department to spend that $100 trillion. It's only mandated and only allowed to spend the money in that account that has been that has been appropriated by Congress to fund the programs that Congress has approved, that Congress has funded. Okay? So, let's look at the graphic now that deals with the coin seigniorage markup. Okay, before we go back to that coin seigniorage, let's take a step back because that completes the third path, which I talked about here. So let's go back to the second path, which is the Treasury Fed sub-process. Steve, right? The Treasury Fed sub-process to get new reserves into the Treasury spending account. The Treasury first orders the Fed to debit the Treasury tax and loan accounts and to credit the Treasury spending account. Then the Fed debits the TT&L accounts, destroying the reserves in those accounts. Now, when it destroys the reserves in those private sector accounts, one of the things which it's doing is draining those reserves from the money supply. But it is not putting any reserves into the Treasury spending account as yet. Okay, that's an important thing to notice. Destroying the reserves in the private sector comes first. only then is there a marking up in the Treasury spending account, which is the markup is the Fed creating new reserves in the government sector that did not exist before. So freezing the process at this point. Money has been destroyed in the private sector by the Fed. And then money is newly created by the Fed in the government sector. So here's a basic reason why MMT says that taxes do not fund spending. Because the Treasury tax funds, the revenue from taxing, and the revenue from the loans, that is from the sale of the debt instruments, is not used by Treasury to spend. That's not what constitutes the final step that gives the Treasury the account balance it needs to complete the spending process. So note here, the first step in the spending process is appropriations by Congress. Then there are a number of operations that take place. Midway through these operations, private sector money is destroyed by the Fed, draining reserves from the private sector money supply. Then the Fed creates new reserves in the government sector, and before the government spends, there are no reserves. In other words, those reserves have not been replaced in the private sector. The reserves that were drained have not yet been replaced. So then the Treasury can spend and can complete its process of spending. That is, after the Fed creates the new reserves in the government sector. So even if someone doesn't accept the idea that it's Congress that is doing the funding, and it thinks that it's the tax revenue or the loan revenue that is the money the Treasury uses to do the spending, then that account would still be wrong, because the Treasury does not use that money to spend. The Treasury must have the high-powered money created by the Fed to spend, because that's the only kind of money that it is authorized to spend by the Congress. The high-powered money created by the Fed in the process of creating the new reserves. So that's why, in a very concrete way, having to do with the accounting and having to do with the operations in the actual funding process, we can say in two ways that taxes don't fund spending. They don't fund spending because the funding is really done by Congress. And even if you don't accept that, then taxes still do not fund spending, because Treasury doesn't use that tax money, nor the money from the sales of debt instruments to spend into the private sector. Instead, the money that is used is the money that the Fed has newly created. So I hope that process is now clear. But there is still a possibility, even when you go through all that explanation, there's still a possibility that people will say to you, well, that sounds like just kind of technical trickery to me. And really, in a realistic sense, the Treasury is using the money from the tax and loan accounts to operationally do the spending, even though the connection is not direct. Okay, it's indirect. So I don't accept the fact that taxes do not fund spending. Okay, I mean, I think taxes do, because but the revenue from the debt instruments will eventually have to be paid by taxes anyway. So what it all comes down to is that only tax revenue actually funds the spending, because there is no other way for Treasury to get money except through the taxing process and the loan process. Now, this kind of argument, this last kind of argument, is the basis for austerity in funding. That's why it's important to understand how someone might argue, even in the face of going through the operations, why they might still argue, even though you've concretely shown them that in the Treasury spending process, it's not using that money from the taxes. It's not using that money from the loan accounts. Even then, they still might insist, oh, that's just a tricky explanation by professors or by some eggheads or stuff like that. The bottom line still is the Treasury couldn't spend, okay, if it did not have at some point, the Fed did not get that money from the Treasury tax and loan accounts. And so the account that we give, that the Treasury spending is constrained by taxing, is still the correct account. It's the correct showing. So then you may have to have recourse to talking about the coin seigniorage process and the markup process. Okay? So, as I've said before, that sub-process starts with the Treasury Secretary getting the Director of the Mint, ordering the Director of the Mint to mint coins and then deposit those coins in an account owned by the Treasury Department, owned actually by the Mint, called the Public Enterprise Fund account, which exists at the Federal Reserve Banks, or actually the New York Federal Bank. So, those coins, okay, that it mints can be of many denominations. But the key point here I want you to focus on is that a 1996 law gave the Secretary the authority to direct the Mint to mint 1 ounce platinum coins with the face value of those coins specified at the discretion of the Secretary of the Treasury. So as long as the coins involved are platinum coins, it is possible for the Secretary of the Treasury, within the legal framework that exists in the United States right now, to mint a single coin worth $50 billion or or $100 billion or $500 billion or $1 trillion. So a few years ago, the big fuss was about the $1 trillion coin. Why was there a big fuss about trying to mint a $1 trillion coin? And that was due to the fact that we were going through a debt ceiling crisis in which the executive branch was put in a bind. It had appropriations from Congress to do spending that would turn out to be deficit spending. But it couldn't use the process of selling any more debt instruments to get the money it needed in its accounts in order to do that spending because of this debt ceiling law that Congress first passed in 1914 and whose ceiling it periodically lifts. It used to lift the ceiling as simply a routine matter. But in recent years, since the Republicans took over Congress as a result of the elections of 2011, the Republicans have adopted the tactic of creating debt ceiling crises, which they then settle by making agreements with the Democrats to defund programs that they don't like, or to freeze spending on certain programs when that spending should be increased. So the Republicans negotiate hard by holding the debt ceiling over the head of the executive branch and saying to the executive branch, unless you compromise with us on these things that we want, we're not going to lift the debt ceiling, and the federal government is going to default on its payments. So you then had crises of this kind in 2011. There were threatened crises in 2012. You had a crisis again at the end of 2012 and in early 2013, and also threats later, until it became unpopular for Republicans to do that. So then they just kind of limited themselves to threats. And they had made an agreement with the Democrats, which was not at all good for the public, following the so-called fiscal cliff in 2012, to deeply freeze spending and use continuing resolutions to keep the government going. So the question always for the president and for the Democratic Party was it possible for the Democrats and for the party to defuse these particular hostage negotiations by using uncommon solutions? Okay, and as it happened in 2010 and 2011, the idea of minting a high-value platinum coin was first mentioned, offered by an attorney by the name of Carlos Mucha, who was writing under the nom de plume of Beowulf. And he came up with this idea, and he advocated for it in comments on blogs. He then collaborated with me in the latter part of 2010, and I had a hand in persuading him to blog about it. So in the early days of 2011, if I recall correctly, January 3rd of 2011, he published the first post about this on Fire Dog Lake. And it was a seminal post in which he laid out the legal case for this. Okay, now, even though he was the first one to mention the idea of using a platinum coin to do this, Ellen Brown had suggested in her book, The Web of Debt, which I think was published first in 2007 or 2008, she published the idea that it was possible for the Treasury to mint coins, okay, of very high value. But she didn't actually lay out the legal justification and also the process, okay, by which it could be done in the same way, okay, as Beowulf. So getting back to the chart then, if such high-value coins are deposited in the Treasury Public Enterprise fund account, okay, as is specified in the Platinum Coin Law of 1996, then there's another law that says when the balance of the public enterprise fund account starts growing large, and the Treasury wants to use the money that's in the public enterprise fund account, then at any time, if it's choosing, the Treasury Department can sweep the PEF account for the seigniorage in it and transfer the seigniorage into the Treasury spending account. So let's go through the steps here. The Treasury deposits a newly minted platinum coin into the public enterprise fund account. Federal Reserve marks up the public enterprise fund for the face value of coins, which as the banking agent of the Treasury Department, it is obligated to do. Now, in just a minute, okay, I'll get to the issue of, well, what happens if the Fed refuses to mark up the PEF account for the face value of the coins? And I'll give you some other laws that deal with that particular question. So let's assume for the moment that the Fed does mark up the PEF for the face value of the coins, okay, that it agrees to do that. Then, of course, the Treasury, through this sweeping notion, which is authorized by law, orders the Fed to mark down its PEF account for a particular amount and mark up its spending account for the seigniorage. In the case of the 100 trillion platinum coin, the seigniorage would be 100 trillion minus $3,500.
Hey, Joe, what is the PEF account, real quick, if you don't mind?
The public enterprise fund account. It's right in the first box of the figure.
Okay, very good.
Public enterprise fund account, okay, or PEF. So the Fed can sweep, the Treasury can order the Fed, can sweep the account by ordering the Fed to mark down the PEF account and then to mark up the Treasury spending account in the amount of the seigniorage, which in the case of the 100 trillion platinum coin is nearly $100 trillion. So, then the final step in the process, of course, is that if there's enough high-powered reserves in the Treasury spending account, then it straightforwardly has enough to spend. It can spend to repay debt instruments that are falling due, and it can do deficit spending. Okay, so now let's get back to the question of what happens if the Fed decides to say to the Treasury, we're not going to mark up the PEF because we don't think platinum coins having large face value are really legitimate things to create. We at the Fed don't interpret the 1996 law in the same way that you do. Well, there are other provisions of law in the federal government which would argue against such a response. The first of these is the Federal Reserve Act itself, which is quite explicit in saying that in cases where there are differences in financial interpretations of law between the chairperson of the Fed and the Secretary of the Treasury, the law says, the view of the Secretary of the Treasury shall prevail. In other words, in relation to the interpretation of a financial transaction, the interpretation of the Treasury Secretary has primacy, has authority over the interpretation of the chairperson of the Federal Reserve. So if the Treasury Secretary says, you have to credit this account, and that's my financial interpretation, then I demand that you go ahead and do it. Okay, if the chairperson of the Federal Reserve says, no, I'm still not going to do it, and the reason why I'm not going to do it is that I'm going to litigate this up to the Supreme Court because we don't think this is a legitimate thing to do. Okay, in that case, it's highly debatable whether the chairperson of the Federal Reserve or any authority inside of the Federal Reserve would get standing in the Supreme Court to actually carry on such a litigation. Why? Because the law is clear, the Federal Reserve Act is clear, that in cases of financial interpretation, the word of the Secretary is to prevail. So what would be the basis for the Federal Reserve to claim standing, in such a case? The Federal Reserve would have to show in a compelling way that it was somehow damaged by this, and that even if it was damaged, that in spite of the law, the Treasury Secretary did not have the authority to make it take the coin and mark up the balance in the PEF account. But really, the language within the Federal Reserve Act is highly explicit. It's highly difficult to interpret that by essentially saying, well, it was not, the intent of the Congress to give the Secretary the final word on all matters of financial interpretation, except matters of financial interpretation having to do with minting a coin and asking the Fed to mark up the PEF account for the face value of the coin. Moreover, the Fed would have to make the case about this, not only in terms of an exception, which is highly implausible, but also in the face of precedent. That is, when the Treasury actually mints coins and ships them to the Federal Reserve, the Fed happily credits the sales proceeds. It pays the face value of those coins to the Mint's Public Enterprise Fund account. It does that as a routine thing all the time, every day. The seigniorage profits are remitted back to the Treasury Department. Well, first they go into the PEF, but then they end up in the Treasury spending account in the billions of dollars every single year. Now, these are not platinum coins, generally speaking, or high-value platinum coins, but they may be $5 coins, they may be $25 coins, they might be $100 coins. The point is, literally millions of coins have been minted and sent to the Federal Reserve, and the proceeds have been created in the Mint's public enterprise account. So the only reason why this wouldn't be the case here, in the particular case of the $100 trillion coin, is because the Fed, which has the unlimited power granted by Congress to create reserves in the accounts of its account holders, that for some reason they're not going to do what they did before. In other words, for a reason that seems compelling to them, but is not compelling to the Secretary of the Treasury, whose financial interpretation is supposed to control them. So let's even go back a step. Let's say the chairperson of the Federal Reserve, and I don't think this would ever happen, okay, decides to deny the secretary and start working on a lawsuit to deliver to the Supreme Court. Then the next move of the executive could well be, because this power is written in the law also, the next move of the executive branch could be for the Treasury Secretary to ask the President to fire the chairperson of the Federal Reserve for cause. It is hard to see that such an action could be contested because, again, the power of the President to do this is plainly stated in the law. And the cause here is plainly stated in the law also, which would be that the chairperson of the Federal Reserve refused to accept the financial interpretation of the Treasury Secretary when he or she was bound by law to do that. So, it seems to me that the chairperson of the Federal Reserve is in a box if the rest of the executive branch wants to pursue this particular course of action. Now, during the Obama administration, Obama, who did not wish to mint the platinum coin, got out of it by saying, or his people got out of it. I don't really remember if he precisely said that, but I think Jack Lew said it, that the Federal Reserve didn't want to accept such a coin. So really, minting it was off the table because there had been lots of speculation in the press and pressure from various parties. There were petitions signed by many thousands of people pleading with the Obama the administration to deal with the debt ceiling crisis by minting $1 trillion coin. Not a $1 trillion coin would have done it. It would have produced a sufficient amount of reserves that the executive branch could have gone through with its mandated spending without increasing the debt ceiling. I mean, the legal recourse was there. However, the Obama administration, which was committed to an austerity program from the beginning, directly after its stimulus program was passed, for obvious reasons, did not want to demonstrate to the public that the Treasury had the power to make the debt ceiling law a dead letter. And so they came up with the excuse that the Federal Reserve wouldn't go along with it. But the problem wasn't that the Federal Reserve wouldn't go along with it, because the Federal Reserve didn't have a choice. It was the choice of the Obama administration to continue negotiating with the Republicans and to accept a hurtful compromise but with them that implemented tighter austerity on the federal government. It was the Obama administration's choice to pursue that course of action. One reason being, they thought that in the process of the negotiations, there would be political advantage for the president and for the Democrats in the 2014 elections if they played it that way. But by the way, in this account, I'm talking about the debt ceiling crisis of 2012 to 2013. I'm not talking about the earlier one in the summer of 2011. And the reason why I'm not is because it's possible to suggest, even though the idea of the $1 trillion coin was getting very popular even back then and was all over the press, articles by Annie Lowry and Paul Krugman, and people like that, it's still possible to suggest that the Obama administration did not really know about or fully comprehend or understand that it could use the platinum coin to get out of the debt crisis of 2011. And so when it settled that debt crisis, in early August, it still could be said or rationalized that, they just didn't know about it, so they accepted an austerity compromise back then. But the even more hurtful compromise was in 2013. And throughout most of the fall of 2012 and January of 2013, the platinum coin issue generated tremendous media attention. All kinds of popular bloggers were talking about the platinum coin, writing about, the platinum coin. It got to the mainstream press even in 2011. The CNN ran a piece on it where Jack Balkin, a lawyer, professor of law, at Yale, was talking about the constitutionality, of minting a platinum coin on CNN in 2011, in July, of 2011. But in December and January of December 2012, January of 2013, everybody was talking about, would the president use the platinum coin to defuse the crisis? Would he use the 14th Amendment? What else would he do to get around the debt ceiling with a recalcitrant Republican Party? Okay. So finally, the story broke. He wasn't going to use either the 14th Amendment or the platinum coin. It's a good thing he didn't try to use the 14th Amendment, because I don't believe it's constitutional to use the 14th Amendment way out to challenge the constitutionality of the debt ceiling law without first availing yourself of other memories that exist which do not directly conflict with the debt ceiling law, such as issuing high-value platinum coins and using those to pay down debt and to do deficit spending. Okay. So he made some public statements. Okay, the administration made some public statements wrapping up the idea of contesting the constitutionality of the debt ceiling law and using the platinum coin in the same bundle, and saying that both were really impractical and we can't use those. Whereas the case of the $1 trillion coin and the case of challenging the constitutionality of the debt ceiling law were really completely different matters. They were different methods of getting around the debt ceiling law. And using the $1 trillion coin did not itself really conflict with the debt ceiling law. I don't think the president, though, once again, wanted to demonstrate to the public the legal authority of the executive branch to fill the public purse, not just with $1 trillion, but with huge amounts, like $100 trillion, to make the debt ceiling law a dead letter for good. Now notice, doing this would not have caused any inflation, okay, or any deficit spending, because the executive would still have had funding for only a portion of the amount that would be in the Treasury spending account. Because Congress really does the funding. And while Congress always funds the repayment of debt, and while it funds a certain amount of deficit spending, those are the things it funds. So if those things totaled, let's say for 2013, let's say if those things totaled, I don't know, $10 trillion in repayment of debt, and another 400 or 500 billion in deficit spending, that would hardly have made a dent in the 100 trillion that existed in that would have existed in the Treasury account if the $100 trillion coin had been minted. So before we get to any technical questions, okay, which arise, which I see that Steve may be getting to ready to raise in relation to inflation, okay, things like that. Okay, I want to summarize this. So there are three paths to spending that I want to highlight here after congressional funding. One is that the Treasury just spends, destroying public sector reserves in its spending account, and while it spends, the Fed creates new private sector reserves in the private sector accounts that the Treasury is spending on behalf of. The second pathway is that the Treasury first draws on the TTL accounts, with the Fed destroying the private sector reserves, and then creating the public sector reserves, followed by Treasury just spending. And the third pathway is that Treasury first creates coins, including platinum coins, and deposits them at the Fed, followed by the Fed creating new reserves in the Treasury spending account based on the seigniorage. Now, I know there will be questions, but I want to get into implications of this before we get into the questions. Okay, because I have an appeal to make first, and I want to make sure that I get that in because time is a little bit limited here tonight. The Austerian view of federal spending, that is, the Austerians refers to the people who want to impose austerity on federal spending and federal budgets. So it squares, or it is what you'll find in the narrative of most of our politicians, the Peterson Foundation network of organizations, most of the progressive groups, almost everyone. They'll tell you the government is like a giant household, and that the only way Treasury can pay for things is through taxing and borrowing to get previously created money, and then transferring that money from the TT&L accounts into the federal spending accounts. Well, I think I've shown you earlier that that's not what happens as a matter of actual operations. So it's wrong to claim that that is what happens. So then the narrative continues, the Austerian narrative continues. It says that when the government borrows to deficit spends, it increases the national debt, now unsustainable without deficit reduction. And then it goes on to say government simply doesn't have, and it cannot get money to solve all the serious problems which the United States actually faces. So that's our excuse. That's why we don't face our problems. It's because we're going to run out of money. We don't have the money. The money is something we can't get. Using this, since spring of 2009, deficit reduction has been a priority for Congress and for the executive branch. So, this Austerian view is just wrong. First, because of the spending path through coin seigniorage. But second, because government is not like a giant household. Because through congressional appropriation, seigniorage, and the TTL past spending, the private sector money is destroyed, and then reserves are newly created through the Fed action and through Treasury spending. So third, Treasury can stop creating debt subject to the limit at its option if it decides to use coin seigniorage or debt instruments called the consols. Now, I saw a question flash by someone. I'm saying Austerian, Teresa, not Austrian. Two different words, though the Austrians are often Austerians. But Peterson is not an Austrian, okay, in economics. He's just an Austerian. He's a neoliberal Austerian who wants to have deficit reduction forever. So I saw flashing across the screen, well, why is coin seigniorage even necessary? The answer is that coin seigniorage would not be necessary to use if Congress would change the law and just reorganize the Federal Reserve to place it directly within the Treasury branch under the Secretary of the Treasury. Then the Treasury Department could just create the federal money to back the banks. And everybody would know the Treasury Department but was doing that. So everybody would know that any debt instruments which the Treasury Department sells are sold for the convenience of the private sector, and not because they're debts that there will be any strain on the Treasury Department to repay, because the Treasury Department will have the direct power to create any money it needs to pay things off. So Congress could do that. So yes, coin seigniorage is not necessary if Congress changes the law. But you say, secondly, that even if Congress doesn't change the law, okay, it's still true that if the debt ceiling law were changed, then the federal government could just keep on issuing debt without limit to deficit spend. It could sell debt instruments. And that would be true. And there would be no need to use coin seigniorage at all. There is no financial need to use coin seigniorage. There is no need, in terms of the powers of the government or the Treasury to use coin seigniorage. It can do debt instruments all the time, except for the political consequences of doing this. That is to say, what is in back of Peterson and the Austerians? What is supporting the debt ceiling law right now? What is creating all the furor and all the fuss and all the business about how are we going to pay for it? It's the fact that the federal government is using debt instruments to deficit spend and is creating this debt, which in the public mind is huge. It's $20 trillion now, $20 trillion. Okay? Now, the reason why coin seigniorage is necessary to use, it's because it's politically necessary to use. It's for political reasons, for communication reasons, for demonstrating and for showing to people that the Austerian arguments are false, that the idea that the federal government, through the Federal Reserve, creates its own money and can do so in unlimited quantities, but neglecting any outcome consequences, but can create whatever it needs to pay its debts, at least. The reason why people don't accept that is because they've accepted the Austerian arguments that only through selling debt instruments and through taxing can the federal government spend. And we've been trying, since I got involved, with MMT, we've been trying for 7 years to get the message through to the mass of people that this is not the case. This is not true. That the debt levels are not significant, that they do not impact the capacity of the government to spend, that they are like certificates of deposits that banks sell all the time to the public, that they're only debts in that sense. They're not debts which in any way restrict or impinge upon the solvency of the federal government. We've been trying to get people to accept those arguments for the last 7 years. Well, I tell you that if Donald Trump tomorrow were to mint a $100 trillion coin, all that BS about the enormous debt would quickly be off the table. All that BS about how the Social Security program and the Medicare programs are imperiling the solvency of the federal government because these programs are going to run out of money. All that BS would go away because everybody would see, it would be plain to everybody that the federal government can create all the money it needs to pay its bills. And its bills are determined by congressional funding. So that's the whole story. Congress funds appropriations, and the federal government can create whatever money it needs to spend those appropriations in various ways. There are no financial constraints. The constraints are real-world outcome constraints, like the possibility of inflation, or the federal government spending on the wrong things, spending on wars, or spending on various kinds of things that don't produce any social value, okay, or any economic value, or any political value. Those are the problems. The financial problems are the faux problems. So, my appeal to action is as follows for this. It's a limited appeal. Okay? It's about, you see every day, and you're going to continue to see the Austerian view saying that we are running out of money and going through the reasoning that the federal government is a giant household and that it cannot pay its bills. And what I want you to do is to reply to those people by calling them out and by telling them about the spending paths and by trying to persuade them that as a matter of the accounting and as a matter of the operations of the Federal Reserve, taxes do not fund spending. But then if they reject that argument, which is actually the primary argument, then you can default to the other argument that this coin seigniorage law exists, and that at its discretion, the executive branch, through the Secretary of the Treasury, can fill the Treasury spending account with $100 trillion to take care of all the debt and all the deficit spending for the next 15 to 25 years. So the idea that the debt is a problem that we must do something about is a faux problem. You need to call them out and explain that to them each time, because only when they get so much static on the web in these terms will they back off the fairy tales that they've been telling and selling for years and years and years, and then have damaged us so gravely. So that's my appeal for tonight. I see we still have a bit of time left for questions that I may not have answered.
I have a question.
Yes, Steve.
Tell us about the zero interest rate policy, ZIRP. and how that would affect debt and how that would affect our ability to spend. What if we were no longer defending a positive interest rate? What if we were simply spending?
Well, if we were simply spending, that of course would be great. I don't see any reason to defend an interest rate. If the Federal Reserve wants to defend an interest rate, then it can do so by paying interest on reserves itself. There's no need for the Treasury Department to be issuing debt in order to drain reserves. Okay, but also make no mistake about it. Even if we had ZIRP, it would still be the case that if the federal government continued to try to spend by selling debt instruments, that in that case, the principal on the debt would still be mounting up. Not as much as now, but really not by a magnitude any less. In other words, if we were running deficits of $1 trillion a year, then the federal debts would be mounting, by roughly $1 trillion a year, assuming that we're rolling all the other principal payments. So there would still be a problem with the debt ceiling laws. There would still be a problem with the Austerians saying, how are you going to pay back all this debt? How are you going to pay back all this debt? This is the problem we got to face. We got to be brave. We got to face this problem. We got to eat our peas. We got to take the hits because the future of our country is at stake. No, this whole fairy tale is bullshit. ZIRP doesn't solve the perceived but false debt level problem which exists in the mind of the public. Now, we will eventually remove that problem. Maybe in another 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, our educational efforts will finally get through and people will come to believe that we are right. That we are right. But meanwhile, our people and ourselves are going to be suffering for those 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 years. If we want to stop that suffering, well, first, it would have been great if Obama had minted the $100 trillion coin in 2011. It would have also been great if he had minted it if he had minted a $100 trillion coin to solve the debt ceiling problem in early 2013. Those things would have been great because they would have demonstrated that the debt ceiling law is a dead letter. And it would have been easy then to get Congress to just repeal the debt ceiling law. Because faced with the two alternatives of having the Treasury continue to issue debt without a debt ceiling, or having the Treasury pay off all the debt by minting platinum coins and using the proceeds, they would rather have the Treasury continue to issue the debt so their boyfriends and girlfriends can have a safe place to park their reserves in interest-bearing Treasury bonds rather than in reserves that the Federal Reserve might pay a lesser sum of interest on. So they would prefer there be as little disturbance to the present system as possible. So they would have repealed the debt ceiling law. Once Obama had done that, there would have been no purpose to have the law anymore anyway. So the Democrats could have gotten rid of it with some of the other Republicans easily during that period of time. Any other questions that I may have missed that flashed across the screen while I was concentrating on answers? Okay, does anybody not understand this argument at this point? I hope I've made it crystal clear. Both for the taxes don't fund spending argument, and also the argument about why coin seigniorage is really a great thing to do.
I think you nailed it, Joe. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
I think you nailed it, buddy. Thank you very much for tonight. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
So let me ask you, what is next for us? What do you think we have to do now, given that we're not having health care, given that we are not having green energy? I mean, I'm looking at it like this, I'll be perfectly honest with you. The way our environment's going, I don't think we got 30 years to figure it out. I don't. And, the way people,
I don't think so either.
So I'm very concerned. I'm in the end, the Fed folks, they have these long plays to the end goal. And so we're in this situation where really, quite frankly, we're stuck where we've got to friggin' force Congress to spend money now.
Okay. Here are things we might do. First, on particular issues which might force Congress to spend money now, we have to focus on them. There's a big groundswell now for H.R. 676, okay, the Medicare for All bill. We got to get behind that, and maybe even work with the Republicans to both pass the benefits of that bill without increasing any taxes that are currently in that bill. The reason why I say that is that the deficit spending on Medicare for All would be of great benefit to the economy. It would create many millions of jobs, many millions of jobs, as well as providing health care to everybody with no copays and also no deductibles. And if it also combined that with no tax increases, it would be a pretty irresistible bill that perhaps a large group of Democrats could combine with some Republicans on. So that's one thing I think that we can work on. Something else, I think that we can work on. And now, in part, I'm speaking from the point of view of an old person. Okay? Our Social Security retirement pensions are extremely stingy compared to other modern nation states, our peers in the international system. They pay roughly double what we pay to their retirees. We need to agitate and work for doubling those payments. There's a political reason why. Right now, there are old white people who are among the mainstays of the Republican Party. And a huge amount of them are on Social Security. And believe me, they can use a doubling of Social Security benefits. advocate for that, phase it in over a short period of time, and that vote is yours. When I say it's yours, I mean it's ours. I think Bernie made a terrible mistake by not campaigning a lot in Florida on that and visiting as many old folks' homes as he could in Florida and all around the country with that kind of appeal. He could have had both the old and the young fully behind them. And how would Trump have done then? Not very well, I think. What about unsustainable student loan debt? We need a debt jubilee there. We don't need half measures. We need a debt jubilee there. We need to get behind that and agitate for it, join protests for it, join young people for it. They have a right to live too and not be burdened with debt for their whole lives for the sake of the banksters. We have the power to create the money to pay off all those debts. I suggest we settle them because it would be a great shame if the banksters got every dollar that they're supposed to get through this. I mean, my version of Trumpism would be to negotiate them down to 50%. Okay, but lift that burden off the students as soon as possible, off the present students and the past students. Make higher education free at all levels, every level, including the graduate school, every single level, including pre-kindergarten, childcare. These are measures that would get support of a clear majority of the country, that might get a clear majority into the streets. So, of course, the most important issue we all face is climate change. But we probably also have to face the fact that only a minority for us feel deeply the climate change issue and that are frightened out of our minds by what's happening to the climate. That's got to be on our agenda. But we got to recognize that that is not enough to get immediate action. Because I don't think you'll ever find the Republicans going for that, because I don't think we can get enough people in the streets to really scare them about that. But the other issues I mentioned, we could get enough people in the streets to make them fear for their offices unless they voted for those specific things. Okay, so I'm for doing that at first. I'm for keeping the issue focus very, very strong. For the longer term, starting now though, I'm for Dem exit. I think the Democratic Party refuses to change and that it is dead. We need a new party that will represent us. I like the idea of getting Bernie to Dem exit. I like the possibility that many others will follow him to Dem exit. I like the possibility that we have a great place in that new party and a great role to play in helping that new party to get into a position where they can represent us. But I also think that we have to continue our issue focus and our education efforts on why the federal government is not financially constrained in spending, but only constrained by real outcomes, such as the impact on people of various measures, also getting price stability. In other words, to get both full employment and price stability seems to me is a big issue if we focus on how many really unemployed people there still are. It is not true, in my view, that we have an unemployment rate of 4.1%, or whatever the hell the current U6 unemployment rate is. Those statistics were jimmied a long time ago to exclude people who, according to the criteria of the Department of Labor, have left our labor force. I don't accept the definition of who has left our labor force, and who has not. Every able-bodied adult is a potential participant in our workforce. Maybe the private sector market doesn't need those people, what I previously called in the job guarantee presentation, the market value sector of the economy. I'm sure the private sector doesn't need all the people who could be working for the market sector part of the economy. But those people can be employed, can work to produce great social value in the social value sector of the economy that the job guarantee program would empower. And so I think it's vital to get all those people involved in creating a better society and a better quality of life for all of us. I think that's a big issue. I think there are still 20 million people who are not employed, who would like to be employed on the basis of a living wage and good fringe benefits, and who would fit into the social value sector. So I'm for emphasizing that a lot, but too.
All right. Joe.
All right.
We are at that point, brother.
Okay, Steve.
I'm going to say thank you so much for this very enlightening talk. Folks, I hope you learned something tonight. Without further ado, I'm going to say thank you so much. We're expecting Zach Haller to come on here momentarily and give us an update regarding the DNC fraud hearing. Joe, thank you so much again for being flexible and rescheduling your Saturday night to tonight.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
So with that, thank you all very much. We will be talking to you soon.
Thank you, everybody, for being here.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.